One of the myths about Vincent van Gogh is that his insanity was the cause of his achievements as an artist, enabling him to suddenly become an artist at the age of 26. Another is that his determination as an artist was the cause of his insanity. The reality gained from reading Van Gogh's letters, written from the age of 19 to his death at the age of 37, is more prosaic. He was someone with a deep knowledge of and dedication to art, who was able to make himself into a great painter, and who was also, coincidentally and ultimately tragically, psychologically unstable. Despite an element of debate as to where modern art begins, there are several key figures linking Impressionism and Post-Impressionism to modernism. Manet worked in the realist tradition, but employed irony and self-reflexivity. Cézanne transformed the canvas through the interrelation of its forms into a subjective motif. Matisse liberated post-impressionist colour from figurative representation. Van Gogh takes his place in this pantheon, the symbolist bridge from Romanticism to modernism, creating a proto-expressionistic style of brushwork to evoke an inner, transcendental vision. It was arguably a romantic concept of an artist, combined with a religious asceticism, which pushed Vincent into a life of hardship and self-neglect, and which may have had a deleterious effect on his underlying mental health problems. Ultimately, it's hard to say, as there's no consensus on exactly what Vincent's diagnosis was, but drinking absinthe could only have compounded the problem. Vincent van Gogh was born on the 30th of March 1853, near the Belgian border in the Dutch town of Groot-Zundert, where his father was a preacher in the Dutch Reformed Church. Vincent was sent to boarding school, where he was profoundly unhappy. In 1869, he began work for the art dealer Goupil and Company, and in his 7 years working in the art market, gained a profound love of 19th century realism. In a letter written in January 1874 from London to his brother Theo, Van Gogh lists his most admired painters, realists including Corot and the Barbizon artists Millet, d'Aubigny and Rousseau, Boudin, Monet's mentor, and Anton Mauve and others of the Hague school, influenced by the Barbizon artists. Mauve would eventually become Van Gogh's teacher. Van Gogh also admired the old masters. Another letter from Theo from Paris in July of 1875 lists the prints on the wall of Van Gogh's bedroom. In addition to Corot, Millet and d'Aubigny, they include Ruysdael and Rembrandt. Van Gogh worked for Goupil and Company in The Hague from the age of 16 to 20, before being transferred to London in June 1873. His second residence there was at Hackford Road between Brixton and Stockwell, and there he fell in love with and proposed marriage to the landlady's daughter, Eugénie Loyer. He was turned down. Transferred to Paris twice, Van Gogh's growing interest in religion went hand in hand with a growing disinterest in the art trade, and he was dismissed from Goupil and Company in January 1876. He returned to England and worked as a teacher in Ramsgate in April, then as an assistant preacher in Isleworth in London, and he returned to the Netherlands to study theology in 1877. His dropping out of university caused a rift with his father, and Van Gogh worked as an evangelist in the coal mining area of Belgium, the Borinage, in 1878. Although Van Gogh had been sketching landscapes as early as 1874, in July of 1879, at the age of 26, Vincent van Gogh decided to become an artist. His former employer Ter Steeg of Goupil and Company provided him with paints, and the following year drawing instruction books, and Van Gogh began to sketch. He met Willem Roelofs, the Dutch landscape painter, and Anton van Rappard, and in a famous letter to Theo from the 24th of September 1880, Van Gogh reveals a pilgrimage he made on foot, sleeping rough, to Jules Breton's hometown, Courrières. For Van Gogh found in art and colour the same spirituality he had found in religion. In the same letter he speaks of how the artist Mérion puts into his etchings something of the human soul, moved by I know not what sorrow, and of Tissot that there is something of the human soul in his work, and that is why he is great, immense, infinite. This sense of the infinite is something that pervades Van Gogh's writing to Theo. A letter of the 3rd of April 1878 states that the need is for nothing less than the infinite and the miraculous. In a long letter on the 21st of December 1881, he writes, I wouldn't give 2 cents for life if there were not something infinite, something deep, something real. The Camargue landscape he describes as beautiful and infinite, like the sea. And in his letter from Arles on the 11th of August 1888, he speaks about wanting to conjure up the mysterious brilliance of a pale star in the blue of infinity. About a trip to the artist's colony in Sveelo on the 16th of November 1883, Van Gogh describes heath stretching to infinity on the right, heath stretching to infinity on the left, nothing but that infinite earth, that infinite sky. Van Gogh moved to Brussels, and after a time at his parents' house and an infatuation for his cousin Kievo Stricker, he moves to The Hague and studies under Anton Mauve, until they fall out over Van Gogh taking a pregnant model, Sien Hurnik, into his house. While in The Hague in August 1882, Van Gogh produces his first paintings. Throughout his writings, Van Gogh shows a spiritual fervour for colour, and a letter from the 20th of August 1882 describes that ecstatic excitement about his first few paintings. You can see that I am plunging full speed ahead into painting. I am plunging myself into colour. The other study from the woods is of large green beech trunks on a ground with dry leaves and the small figure of a girl in white. The big difficulty there was to keep it bright and to get some space between the trunks standing at various distances, the position and relative thickness of the trunks changing with the perspective. In short, to do it in such a way that one could breathe and walk about in it and smell the wood. I particularly enjoyed doing this as much as something I saw at Scheveningen, a large stretch of dunes in the morning after the rain, the grass a relatively deep green, and on it the black nets spread out in enormous circles, creating deep reddish-black, green and grey tones on the ground. On this sombre ground there sat or stood or walked like strange dark ghosts, women with white caps, and men spreading or repairing the nets. Here nature was as gripping, curious, sombre and severe as the most beautiful Millet, as one can imagine. Over the landscape, a simple grey sky with a bright streak above the horizon. Van Gogh then lived with his parents in Nuenen from late 1883 to late 1885. And in those 2 years, the work that Van Gogh had done on drawing translated itself into his early style, which provided the foundation for his later work. Van Gogh painted rural motifs such as weavers and portraits of the local workers, applying striated paint marks in lines of colour in a synthesis of a drawn sketch with exaggeratedly angular lines and a finished painted style with thick impasto marks. Already, Van Gogh's heightened sensitivity to colour is evident, despite his palette dominated by earth tones. His time in Nuenen produced this work, a masterpiece which Van Gogh always saw as an integral part of his oeuvre, despite the radical change in his style later in France. As we have seen, Van Gogh was passionate about the realists and Barbizon artists, in particular Millet, who had painted rural workers in the fields, including scenes of potato harvesting, but always in the context of transcendental and moral concerns. Van Gogh describes similar themes in The Potato Eaters, in a letter to Theo from the 30th of April 1885. The point is that I've tried to bring out the idea that these people eating potatoes by the light of their lamp have dug the earth with the self-same hands they are now putting into the dish, and it thus suggests manual labour and a meal honestly earned. In my opinion, it would be wrong to give a painting of peasant life a conventional polish. If a peasant painting smells of potato steam, fine, but a painting of peasant life should not be perfumed. Van Gogh then spent the first 2 months of 1886 studying at the Antwerp Academy, and it was here that he came into contact with the vogue of Japoneserie, or Japanese Ukiyo-e art from Tokyo, newly introduced to Europe. On the 1st of March, on his brother's advice, he left for Paris, where his brother was living, and the impact of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist works, of which Van Gogh had hitherto been largely unaware, was profoundly transformative. The bright palette of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist works, as well as of the Ukiyo-e painters, impelled Van Gogh to abandon the earth tones of the Barbizon school and embrace brighter, unmixed colour. The catalyst for this transformation were the artists that Van Gogh met early in 1887 in the shop of Père Tongri, an art merchant and dealer. Artists such as Émile Bernard and Paul Signac, with whom Van Gogh painted in Asnières. Through Theo, Van Gogh met Camille Pissarro, Degas, Monet and Cézanne, and eventually Seurat and Gauguin. Another myth about Van Gogh, based perhaps on his time in Arles when he failed to achieve his aim of an artist's colony, is the image of the artist as somehow incapable of organization. Yet while in Paris, he arranged exhibitions of Japanese prints in the Café du Tambourin in March 1887 and an exhibition of the Post-Impressionists, then known as the Impressionists of the Petit Boulevard, in the Restaurant du Chalet in November of that year. An exhibition including Gauguin, Pissarro, Bernard and Toulouse-Lautrec. However, Van Gogh's relationship, probably an amorous one, with the owner of the Café du Tambourin, the Italian Agostina Segatori, ended acrimoniously. By early in the next year, Van Gogh was ready to leave Paris, stating later to Gauguin that he was seriously sick at heart and in body, and nearly an alcoholic because of my rising fury at my strength failing me. To his brother Theo, he wrote, "I plan to spend some time in the south, where there is even more colour and even more sun." And so, in February 1888, Vincent van Gogh left for the south, arriving in Arles railway station on the 20th of February for one of the most productive and infamous periods in artistic history. With the influence of Signac lessened, Van Gogh's earlier interest in ukiyo-e painting re-emerged, painting blossoms in Arles in the spring, often with ukiyo-e artists' typically low horizon and insistent framing of the subject. As a result, the foundations of Van Gogh's style in drawing also re-emerged, with strong impasto striated brushwork, unifying the canvas in a projection of Van Gogh's vision of nature with the immanence of the infinite imbued in it. Van Gogh travelled by stagecoach down to the Mediterranean for his only visit, painting in Sainte-Marie de la Mer in the Camargue, sketching and painting there in the same newly developed style. Back in Arles, Van Gogh began to paint a series of a motif which would become at the centre of his vision, wheat fields in blazing yellow. Just as the Mediterranean light had transformed the work of so many artists before him, Monet included, Van Gogh sought out subjects with the colour yellow predominating. He also returned to a motif using yellow that he had painted repeatedly in Paris of still lifes of sunflower heads, this time painting them in vases. But despite having left Paris and the dissolute life, Van Gogh's thoughts dwelt on ideas of his troubled state of mind. In a letter to the fellow Dutch artist and friend Anton van Rappard, Van Gogh had stated that art is something which, though produced by human hands, is not wrought by hands alone, but wells up from a deeper source, from man's soul. Ultimately, Van Gogh's aim in painting nature in all its forms, which he saw as God's infinite creation, was to find the beauty of objects through the meditation of painting, to find the beauty of the human soul as it apprehends nature through art. But having left Paris and the dissolute life, Van Gogh's thoughts still dwelt on ideas of his troubled state of mind. Van Gogh was, through liberated colour and brushwork, achieving his aim of allowing art to well up from his own soul, but he was finding that soul to be a frightening entity. In a letter from the 4th of May 1888, Van Gogh says of his family that "we are among those who suffer from a mental illness rooted quite a long way back in the past." More disturbingly, in a letter from the 20th of the same month, Van Gogh talks about the effects of potassium iodide, a treatment for syphilis which had been in use since the 1820s. He may have been referring to his brother's neurosyphilis, which was to cause Theo's death soon after Vincent's, but it could refer to Van Gogh himself. The late stages of the untreated disease bring about episodes of depression and mania. Hence, Vincent van Gogh's sense of foreboding regarding his mental health in the early summer of 1888 coincided with a period of intensely creative and liberated work, in which intense subjective colour and insistent gestural brushwork was used expressionistically to create a feeling in the observer confronted by the immensity or infinite minutiae of nature. However, that the illness and creativity coincided is not proof of a causal relationship. Similarly, Gauguin's stay in November and December of 1888 in the Yellow House with Van Gogh is sometimes seen as being the catalyst for the latter's breakdown on December the 23rd. But again, that the two events coincided is not proof of a causal relationship. Gauguin, however, blamed their respective temperaments. Between two beings, as he and I, the one a perfect volcano, the other boiling too inwardly, a sort of struggle was preparing. Gauguin described the events of that night. I had almost crossed the Place Victor Hugo when I heard behind me a well-known step, short, quick, irregular. I turned about on the instant as Vincent rushed towards me, an open razor in his hand. My look, at the moment, must have had great power in it, for he stopped, and lowering his head, set off running towards home. Reaching the square, I saw a great crowd collected. Near our house there were some gendarmes and a little gentleman in a melon-shaped hat, who was the superintendent of police. This is what had happened. Van Gogh had gone back to the house and had immediately cut off his ear close to the head. He must have taken some time to stop the flow of blood, for the day after there were a lot of wet towels lying about on the flagstones in the two lower rooms. The blood had stained the two rooms and the little stairway that led up to our bedroom. When he was in a condition to go out, with his head enveloped in a Basque beret which he had pulled far down, he went straight to a certain house where, for want of a fellow countrywoman, one can pick up an acquaintance, and gave the manager his ear, carefully washed and placed in an envelope. "Here is a souvenir of me," he said. Van Gogh was hospitalized in Arles, and he was treated by Dr. Félix Rey, and after his official discharge in February, with the Yellow House flooded, he continued to live in the hospital. By May, Van Gogh had voluntarily committed himself to a more comfortable asylum just outside the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, about 15 miles northeast from Arles. He would stay there until May of the following year. Van Gogh's attitude to his attacks, as he called them, was ambivalent. On the one hand, he recognized that his attacks prevented him from working. However, this statement from the 9th of January 1889 would seem to imply that he at least saw a link between his condition and his creativity. "Now, if I recover, I must start afresh, but I shall never again be able to reach the heights to which the illness, to some extent, led me." He was wrong, producing masterpiece after masterpiece that year. He painted in the hospital grounds in Saint-Rémy until his doctor, Dr. Perron, allowed him to go out to paint the landscape. In the first week of his confinement, he painted this work, Irises, which was exhibited in the autumn Salon des Indépendants, along with Starry Night over the Rhône. The painting has the insistent close-up framing of the subject of an ukiyo-e painting, with no horizon, and has a fluid and calm gestural facture. Since August of the previous year, Van Gogh had spoken of the intention to conjure up the mysterious brilliance of a pale star in the blue of infinity, and now, at Saint-Rémy, he was able to paint, through the bars of his room, this night landscape, entitled Starry Night. In total contrast to the practice of painting en plein air in one sitting to capture the optical effects of nature, Van Gogh has painted in several sittings, including work done in the daytime, and has exaggerated and invented parts of the landscape. In reality, the cypress tree on the left was further away and smaller, and there was no village with church in the position it is depicted. Later in 1889 there is an emerging symbolism in Van Gogh's work, with his usual motifs such as cornfields, or new ones such as the olive grove, taking on an intensely subjective aspect. About the olive grove motif he wrote, "If I stay here, I shall not try to paint a Christ in the Garden of Olives, but shall paint the olive harvest as one can still see it today, and by giving the human figure its proper place in it, one might perhaps be reminded of it." This passage is on the motif of the cornfield and the reaper. "I'm struggling with a canvas I started a few days before my illness, a reaper. The study is all yellow, extremely thickly painted, but the subject was beautiful and simple. For I see, in this respect, a vague figure toiling away for all he's worth in the midst of the heat to finish his task. I see in him the image of death, in the sense that humanity might be the wheat that he is reaping. So it is, if you like, the opposite of the sower which I tried to do before. But there is no sadness in this death. This one takes place in broad daylight, with the sun flooding everything with a light of pure gold." In May of 1890, Van Gogh came back to Paris, and soon afterwards, at Camille Pissarro's suggestion, went to stay in Auvers-sur-Oise, just to the northwest of Paris, in the care of Dr. Gachet, but staying above the Ravoux Inn. He was to live there for 70 days. Although in Saint-Rémy, Van Gogh had focused on landscape as a form of escape from the confines of the asylum, in Auvers, he was able to return to the genre that he was most passionate about, the portrait, painting Dr. Gachet at his house. However, Dr. Gachet had sunk into depression after the death of his wife, and was "sicker than I am," according to Van Gogh, and hence he compared the situation to the blind leading the blind. On the 10th of July, Van Gogh wrote to his brother that, "I have painted 3 more large canvases. They are vast stretches of wheat under troubled skies, and I didn't have to put myself out very much in order to try and express sadness and extreme loneliness." On the 27th of July, Vincent van Gogh shot himself in the wheat field he had been painting, and died 2 days later.